Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you to Peter as well. Peter was actually the meetup organizer of the first meetup I ever spoke at. So it's always nice to come back and see Peter's face and speak at events that he's involved in. So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Claire. I am calling tonight from here, Marshall, Michigan. So if anyone can see, there's a hockey jersey behind me. Extra points if you can name the team and who the player is. And we're going to have a bit of changing light throughout this presentation. I normally don't live here, so it's not my perfect AV setup, but such is the way when living in a pandemic. So yeah, hopefully it's okay in terms of AV today. Normally I live in Philadelphia and I work for this company, Fishtown Analytics. We make this product, DBT. Tonight's talk isn't a ton about DBT, but we do touch on it a little bit. It's actually more about my journey as a data analyst when I was working at a startup in Sydney. So even though we're on the data engineering track, I hope this talk is useful for those who work with data analysts, which is hopefully all of you. And hopefully everyone can take something out of this presentation. So we're going to talk tonight. Also, I'm going to say that tonight instead of today because I'm in a very different time zone. We're going to talk tonight about how to be a more impactful data analyst. So to talk about more, we have to start off with the starting point. I call this the before time, what it looked like to be a data analyst when I first started in the role. So when I first started out, I inherited this BI system that our previous data analyst had basically passed over to me. And it took me quite a while to wrap my head around it. But after a while, I became the holder of all knowledge. If you wanted to know something about the business, I was the person to ask. For example, only I could answer what was our exact revenue for last month, because it required a very specific formula. There was very little or out-of-date documentation living somewhere in Google Sheets or Confluence. And if you tried to do it any other way, you would end up with a different number, and then we would discuss why the numbers were different, as opposed to actually, taking actions based on our revenue. And I'm going to be honest, at first, this actually felt kind of great. I felt really valuable in this role. I was like, cool, I'm important. Like any question you have about the business, you've got to go through me. But if we haven't guessed it already, that eventually starts to wear you down a little bit. I created this service model around this type of work. If you want to know what the revenue was, if you had any other question about the business, you had to put a request in, it would go into the backlog, and I'd work on it at some point in the future, maybe, depending on who you were in the organization. Sometimes we refer to this as the traditional analyst workflow. It's a pretty familiar workflow, especially for data teams of around 10 years ago or so. You'll also hear it being referred to as the service model. So over time, this went from feeling really great to actually feeling frustrating. This backlog kept growing. It just kept getting bigger and bigger. Every time I gave an answer to a data question, 10 new data questions popped up. I just had this feeling of being outnumbered, verging on overwhelmed. I stopped learning new skills. So once I'd sort of wrapped my head around how the data stack worked, I was just so busy churning out reports, I couldn't do anything new or interesting other than different versions of those same reports. And really, there was like this limited career path. So when you compare the title of data analyst to data engineer or data scientist, it's just not seen as shiny, and the salary kind of reflects that. And this just didn't make sense to me. Data analysts knew a lot about the business. They were really good at their job, but there was just nowhere to go with this model of work. On the flip side, it also felt frustrating for the organization. I became a bottleneck and stakeholders would get impatient and they'd just end up doing the reports themselves, which would end up taking much longer to resolve in the end. So I just had this feeling like, isn't there a better way? Isn't there some other way that we can do this? Now, I'd love to stand here and say that like I had this thought, I had the light bulb moment, I wrote down the plan and I executed on it. That was definitely not the case. The presentation tonight is aided by hindsight, and hopefully I can package it up in a nice way so that other people can learn from my mistakes and also my wins. So the key to getting out of this service model of work was learning how to scale myself. By scaling myself, I mean this idea of getting twice as much work done without doing twice as much work, like putting twice as much effort in. If you can achieve that, as a result, you can do less repeated work, you can work on more interesting projects over time, and you can become more valuable to the business. You can become more impactful. So we've got the before time, we've got what we're aiming for, but how do we actually get there? Fortunately, I've prepared this terrible infographic to help us along the way. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the feeling of being on a hamster wheel, feeling like you're outnumbered, you're spinning your legs as fast as you can, but really getting nowhere. And in the top, in the enlightenment corner, we have this happy little hamster, this person that's figured out how to do things the right way. So let's break this down into a few different steps. At first, when someone needed that report about revenue, they'd come to my desk, they'd put the request in, and I'd work on it in our BI tool. We were using Looker at the time. I'd also mess around with Tableau. I loved Excel, so sometimes I would just do it really quickly in Excel. So the first thing that I did to sort of break out of this pattern of work was that I learned SQL. I already knew a little bit how to write SQL, but I really started to push what I knew. SQL is the lingua franca of data, the common language. If you don't know it, you should definitely know it. If there are analysts on your team who don't know it, they should definitely learn it. If your organization is of the viewpoint that you don't need SQL to be able to do data analysis, I would seriously reconsider that viewpoint. Every single high-performing data team that I've come into contact with has been SQL first. And the reason that SQL is so important is that it allows you to express your business knowledge in code. By business knowledge, I mean that exact formula. What is a refund versus a cancelled order? When did your business change their fees from a flat structure to a variable structure? What does that field actually mean with that name that makes no sense whatsoever? And don't forget the fact that user ID 1 is the CEO and she just messes around on the app on the weekend. We can't actually count that as revenue because it's not real money in our bank. The other way that I like to express this is all the things that you learn about a business that if you were to change companies would be wasted brain space. By writing it in SQL, you can express it in code. The other thing that's worth saying is that there's a really big difference between SQL that works and SQL that's good or that's maintainable. Maintainable SQL is easier for other people to read, including yourself in 6 months' time when you come back to it and you're wondering, what on earth was I thinking at the time? It's easier to debug, it's easier to extend, it's so much better than SQL that just gets the job done. For anyone who's looking to level up their SQL skills, check out this style guide. I'll pop this link in the Slack chat at the end of this. This is Mazur's SQL style guide. It's also pretty searchable, and it has a ton of examples of SQL conventions and why one is preferred over the other. And if you use all of these, you'll end up writing pretty good SQL. So now when that person came to my desk and said, hey, I need the numbers for revenue last month, rather than relying on the tools I was familiar with, the BI tools, I pushed myself to write the code that I needed in SQL. But that SQL often lived in a web editor. It lived in the Snowflake UI. It lived maybe in Looker's SQL editor, if anyone's familiar with that. Sometimes it just lived in files on my desktop, in Google Drive, not in great places. And it meant that if I made a change to it, I'd have to remember that I made that change or update the bookmark or all sorts of things. The next thing that I did was that I learned how to version control my code. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of version control. Basically, in short, version control helps you manage changes to your code. No more orders, this one is final.xlsx, none of that. This one's definitely final this time. To do this, I learned Git. Did an online course for the basics, Googled when I was stuck. Half of learning how to do these sorts of things is learning how to Google. And I learned to ask for help when I was really stuck. I was working at a startup. I had a team of 40 software engineers at the organization as well. So if I was doing something in Git that didn't make sense to me, maybe I got myself stuck and I wasn't sure how I got there, I was able to put up my hand and say to someone, hey, can you help me out? And someone would always offer to help. I created a repo. I think I actually got my CTO to create the repo for me, and he might be listening to this today because I didn't have GitHub rights to do it. So I got someone to create a repo for me, got added to the GitHub organization, and moved all of my most used queries into .sql files in that repository. And I learned to open PRs when I needed to make changes. Now, at the time, I was a one-person data team. So I was opening up pull requests just for the sake of merging them. No one was reviewing them, but I figured it was the way the rest of the team was doing it, the rest of the tech team, I should probably do it too. So now when someone came to my desk to ask for the revenue numbers, I had an absolute source of truth for the queries that I could use. And I could also track the changes to those queries over time, thanks to version control. The next thing that I did was that I learned how to build a transformation layer. So what do I mean by a transformation layer? Essentially, I turned my most used queries into views and tables in my data warehouse. I'd already done this a little bit playing around. I was actually using Redshift at the time in, with Redshift SQL, create schema, create view as, writing the DDL myself. But then I stumbled upon dbt and started to use that instead. Now, I do work for dbt, so massive vendor disclaimer here. Sorry, for the company that makes dbt. But the reason I moved there is because I fell in love with the product. So it goes the other way around in terms of causation there. At an extremely, extremely high level, dbt is an open source tool that allows you to express your transformations in SQL. I already had my transformations in SQL files in a Git repo. And then by replacing the references to tables with this ref function, dbt creates a directed acyclic graph, a DAG, from your transformations. When you tell dbt to run, it's going to iterate through this DAG in the correct order and turn every single query into a view or a table, depending on how you have things configured. You don't have to write any create view as, any create table as. It's just all select statements. And the only magic thing is this ref function. Once I created this transformation layer, I connected my BI tool to those views and tables rather than running those queries again and again. This made my business knowledge accessible to others. Rather than having to find the query for the revenue, there was a table of orders with a column that said revenue, and you could just sum that up really easily. I also added documentation, which was huge for me at the time. And one of the cool things about dbt is you get this built in. You get this like doc site that gets automatically generated. You can see it's on my local host there. This doc site automatically generated that describes your transformations, and you can add descriptions as well. So now when someone needed that report, I could leverage the views and the tables that I already had in my database that had the information they needed. I didn't need to rerun that query. I could set up automated reports in our BI tool and take some of that workload off me. The next thing that I did was that I learned to apply software engineering practices to this transformation layer. I'm sure for many of you on the call, these are going to be super familiar. But for me at the time, these were completely new concepts. Remember, when I started, I was most comfortable in Excel. So I learned to write new code or change existing code in a separate sandbox environment. I learned what a sandbox environment meant. I added tests to my code. I wrote dry and modular code. If you remember that animation, you can see it's really easy to create those extra nodes just with that ref function. So it made it easy to break up my big queries into modules. And I learned how to run my transformations on a schedule and put in monitoring and alerting so I could find out if anything went wrong. This is really useful because before this, the way that I found out that a dashboard had broken was that the CEO would Slack me on a Monday morning or a Sunday evening and say, hey, these numbers don't look right. By applying these software engineering practices, I got onto the forefront of those data quality issues. So now when someone came to my desk to ask for that revenue number or to ask for a different number, we could feel more confident in the numbers that they were seeing. I could also build those new reports really quickly. I could make changes if we did figure out that, hey, our pricing structure changed there and we need to account for that in our transformations, and do all of that with less disruption to the end user. The last thing that I did here was not so much of a skill that I learned, but more of a mindset change. And this was that I realized I was building a product. By realizing I was building a product rather than being a service provider that took tickets and worked through them, I could change the way that I worked. I got to consider my stakeholder. If someone was asking me for, the revenue for today, what are the next 5 questions they're going to ask? They're probably going to want to know, how can I divide that into categories? What are the different, is that increased or, is that from churn customers or new customers? All these extra questions that's going to generate. So basically could apply design thinking, putting myself in the stakeholder's shoes. It also gave me the freedom to start to conduct internal training. So rather than being the person that provided them the report, talk to them about how can you get this report yourself and enable self-service reporting. And this last point is also kind of vague, but really meaningful for me. I changed my workflow and I started to have a roadmap. So before I just had this Kanban board that just kept growing and growing. It was to do, in progress, and done. Instead, I went onto a sprint cycle, the exact same sprint cycle as the rest of the team. I had things that I was working towards and I could estimate my work and put it into 2-week sprints and then report on it the same way that everyone else in the engineering organization was reporting on their velocity as well. So now when someone came to my desk and wanted that report, they could often, or actually, they often didn't need to even get to my desk. They could find the answer themselves. Or I'd ask them, hey, what have you tried? Let's figure out where this went wrong and sit with them and learn how to make that experience easier. And manage to scale myself and manage to go from this hamster on the hamster wheel, feeling like I was getting nowhere, to being really happy at the top here. By this point, my day-to-day looked pretty different to what it looked like when I first started out. I spent my time building new transformations, adding tests, and adding documentation to those transformations. I basically spent most of my time in a code editor. I spent my time training stakeholders, as I mentioned. And the other cool thing was that I actually started to spend time working on the quality of the source data. So rather than being in the position of having to continuously clean the data, talking to the back-end and front-end engineers to learn how we could change the relational database that powered the app, as well as the front-end tracking, to make sure that we could answer the analytics questions our team had in a much better way. So this day-to-day was really good for me. I really, really enjoyed this work. But it came up, sort of surfaced a few questions over time. Was I still a data analyst? Not really. I think data analysts are really good at answering the why. Why did revenue go up? Why did it drop? Is this a real significant change, or is this just seasonal fluctuations? Okay, so I'm not really a data analyst. It's not what I spend my time doing. So I guess I'm a data engineer? Well, not really either. Sure, I adopted the practices of a software engineer, but I wasn't moving big data around. I learned to write Python, but didn't really use it. I spent most of my time in SQL. I didn't write DDL or DML. I let my transformation layer do all of that for me. So I don't know. I didn't know what I was. But I liked the work that I did, and it turned out that it was both valuable and valued. So I didn't know. Fortunately, these days, we have a name for that. So it turns out that I was somewhere in the middle. We now call this an analytics engineer. They sit somewhere between data engineers and analysts. If you're working on a one-person data team, chances are the kind of work that you do most closely fits an analytics engineer. You're often trying to just keep the machine running and getting all these different pipes working together, so that you can get reporting to your stakeholders. This is not to say that this role replaces analysts or engineers. Data analysts are still really good at answering those why questions, but it's important to notice that if you have an analytics engineer doing all this work, those analysts can work way more effectively. And so can your data scientists. They don't need to spend a lot of time doing feature extraction and cleaning up the data. Just give them the table that already has the clean data in it. It also frees up data engineers. We've worked with a ton of companies where data engineers spend their whole day figuring out the intricacies of Redshift, create schema syntaxes and inserts and things like that. By freeing up your data engineer, they can work on more interesting problems, like building custom ingestions or managing overall orchestration of pipelines. So I did title this talk, How to Be a More Impactful Data Analyst, but I have done a bit of a bait and switch here. I've sort of revealed at the end that it turns out the way to be a more impactful data analyst is to be an analytics engineer, kind of a separate role entirely. And so that's my journey from, data analyst to analytics engineer. And I guess that leaves us with, where am I today? Today, my role title is DBT Community Manager. It's pretty much my role to help more people along this same path. I found this career transition to be extremely impactful. I found that I could command a higher salary. I found that I could speak with people, the engineers on my team, in a way that made sure they actually respected my opinion. I found that the work that I was doing was being reused time and time again, that it was being built upon. So I love this transition so much that I took this role as community manager to try to facilitate other people going through that same career growth. In this role, I get to have a really cool bird's eye view of the industry. We have around 2,000 companies using our software, most of them using the open source version. And we have 5,000 members in our Slack. And I get to work with hundreds of individuals from dozens and dozens of different data teams. And so I get to see what's happening at a macro level. I can see dozens of people at any one time making this same progression, going from feeling really frustrated about not being able to do anything about the data they were working with to learning how to manage it and make it better. I see individuals graduating from AE roles, people who skilled up really quickly, and then they went, actually, I really like the data engineering side of things, and so I'm going to lean into that. Or people have branched out into their own consulting firms and are now helping other companies do this. Or even a few people who have taken on chief of staff roles, because it turns out the skills you learn in this role about how to be more impactful and how to scale yourself are pretty transferable to a lot of other parts of the business. I've seen way more people identifying themselves as analytics engineers and way more people hiring the role of analytics engineers. We had a meetup in New York a few months ago, back when we could do those things. And we had about 120 people turn up just to hear a panel on analytics engineering, which in New York, where there's events all the time, that's a pretty impressive turnout. And the last thing that I can see is communities forming around these practices. Whether it's the locally optimistic community, whether it's the Sydney data community, whether it's our own DBT community, you can see people sort of discovering these practices and realizing how powerful they are and wanting to learn from each other. So that's it. Where to from here? I'm not sure. Maybe in 2 years, I'll be giving a presentation on the next evolution of my career as well. So that's my story. I hope that it can shape some of yours. If nothing else, I hope that it encourages either yourself or the analyst on your team to learn to write better SQL, because that's the foundation upon which we can do all of these other really amazing things. Thank you.